All right. Welcome to, I'll call this chapter 2, depending on whether you're taking the security plus exam or student at university. But basically, I'm going to cover risk management and then cybersecurity. Again, I'm going to share my screen using some slide deck. And then you can be free to ask me any questions on the contents of the slide, to send me a message. And don't forget to always subscribe, and let's move on. So risk management is a very important concept in cybersecurity. Here, this is again chapter 2. That's how to connect with me on all the social media platforms, even WhatsApp. You can freeze the video. This obviously just background information, copyright information for Third Bird and the other company, Atawa Technologies, for some of the contents. So in chapter 2, basically we look at calculating and managing risk, and then how you do security assessment and auditing, how to conduct vulnerability scans and pen testing. Again, it's not possible to keep this video under 10 minutes, but at the end of this slide deck, I do share a link to another video that I have that is just approximately 9.59 minutes. But again, there's 3 modules here, module A, B, and C. Let me go over them quickly. In module A, on risk management, the whole idea is how do you identify assets and threats? How do you calculate risk? And of course, how do you now choose your risk management strategies? So this is called the risk management cycle, from identifying your risk to assessing the risk, to obviously controlling the risk, and then review or continuous monitoring. So it's like a cyclical process. How do we identify risk to our organization or to even us as individuals? So the whole idea is I want to find, recognize, and describe the potential risk. But the first part of this is to really determine the scope of what you want to protect. What do I really want to protect, right? Because that will guide my risk management approach. So one of the things you need to do is obviously try to identify your assets. If you remember in chapter 1, I said, if you replace the S, the 2 S's after A to $, people tend to take it more seriously, especially management. But assets includes everything from your normal information on your data, that could also, or data, depending on which part of the world you're talking for, right? Customer information, IP as an intellectual property, operational data, partner information, also tangible property, cash or financial assets, of course, branding and your business reputation. These are part of what you consider assets. But as part of also doing this, you need to do what's called a threat assessment. Accidents and disasters, equipment failure, supply chain failure, human error, could be from employees and negligence, malicious outsiders like hackers, and of course, malicious insiders, which would be employees inside that want to do you harm, not the ones that just made a mistake. This is all part of assessing the threat to your organization. When you do this, you basically want to figure out a method for identifying your risk. So this would be internal and external source of the risk, reviewing it. I need to conduct interviews with knowledgeable parties, brainstorm about the potential risk, do a SWOT analysis, which is strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats, or do the reverse, which is tools, right? And of course, scenario analysis. And you should have some kind of checklist of maybe common errors, and of course, create what's called a risk breakdown structure. It's similar to work breakdown structure for project management. Those of us that are project managers will be familiar with that. But when you're doing all of this, you're probably going to need to create a deliverable document. We call it a risk register. So your risk register should have like a unique ID, some kind of clear description of your risk, and category, the likelihood of the risk occurring, what is the BIA, or that's in the business impact analysis, if that particular risk happens or materializes, and then overall risk level. So what's called a track your KRI. We talked about it in chapter 1, key risk indicators. What are the mitigation steps and your strategies? And then what would be your residual risk? Residual risk means the remaining risk after you've employed your mitigation strategies, right? And of course, contingency plans and who's the owner of risk. So what I did here was I tried to show you some example of how a risk register might look at. This is a simplified one. You got your risk ID on here, describe the risk, the impact of the risk, the likelihood of it occurring, and then of course, some notes about mitigation risk. For example, risk 002, data breach, it's high. And of course, what would you do to fix it, improve your security, right? Well, another way to do that is to use the previous slide where I talked about this. This one here is a little convoluted, but it still has kind of similar issues. So what's the contingency here? There's a little error in here, says contingency, because this particular one here, I used DALI in AI to create this table. As you know, sometimes AI needs to be amended, but what I really need you to pay attention is stuff like the ID number. But then Michael Yehoshua, one of my people I just read recently on LinkedIn, has his own kind of like a risk register example. But what he does here is he mixes it with what's called a business impact and risk value. So in his own chart, he looks at it a little differently, like calculated values and how do you approach it. But check out this YouTube link. I did mention to him that I'm going to be covering this, and I'll put his chart on here. All right, so who owns the risk? This is a very important concept of risk management. I have a little music on the background to try and drown out the construction noise there, if it's possible, so just bear with me, right? You need to assign the risk so that the organization will know how to treat it. And then, of course, risk assessment, there are different approaches to that. We'll summarize it here as 4. You can do a one-time risk assessment, or you can do an ad hoc risk assessment, which is basically you do it as needed. Of course, a recurring one and continuous risk assessment also. But the whole idea is you need to figure out the impact, right? Do an analysis, right? So one method for impact analysis is by the US government, mandated by FISMA. It's called FIPS 199. For this, you're basically going to assess information in the system based on the CIA triad that we covered in chapter 1, and then rate it as either low, moderate, or impact for each of the categories. So this is usually used a lot for US government system. So when you're doing this, you also might need to do what's called a private impact assessment. But doing that, you have what's called a privacy threshold analysis. This chapter doesn't go into like content for somebody who wants to do like a CISA certification or GRC certification with just overview. But if you want, you can also look at some of my other videos on that if you want to study for another certification. But when you're doing your PTA, you're also looking at, hey, do I have any PII as in personally identifiable information involved, right? If I feel like he has it in there, I need to figure out how to do the privacy impact assessment. So this page just talks about the PTA and then the PII as it relates to the risk assessment. So I'm sorry for all the initials, but cybersecurity, it's a lot of like alphabet soup, right? So how do we do probability analysis of our threat or threat probability? Things like existing logs, research relevant factors. So if equipment is going to fail, I need to be aware of that, right? I need to also think about what security organizations of vendors normally publish about statistics, and then look at threat trends involving a malware. Because even your business process can also obviously be vulnerable, right? But the point is that if you're doing this threat probability, if you're not too experienced or you need more help, it's okay to seek outside expert guidance or consultation. But we have all these initials in here. They're called reliability terminology, mean time to failure, which is an average time for an equipment to fail, mean time to repair, mean time between the failures, like failure A, B, of course, mean time between service incidents. These are metrics. Sometimes they relate to hardware, but just to give you an idea as to how reliable that particular equipment would be. The lower two points, RTO and RPO, I need to just explain them. We use them in disaster recovery. The RTO, recovery time objective, it means if my system were to fail now, I had a problem today, how long does it take for me to get back operation, right? So we use it in disaster recovery, business continuity, planning, and all that. So my system went down today. I went down at 9 a.m., maybe 2 hours, I could be down and I'll be able to get back operational. So that's like it would help me figure out maybe how long my system could be down before maybe I have a serious loss to my business. The RPO tends to deal with data, information. In other words, I got ransomware at 11 o'clock, but I did my backup at 9 p.m. last night. So you see, from 9 p.m. last night to 11 a.m. this morning, that's approximately like 14 hours of data. So if I wasn't going to pay for the ransomware, how much data can I really afford to lose? So this should also inform my backup strategy. But just try and look at my other video on disaster recovery and a different module. I cover it a little more in depth, right? All right, so when we're doing statistics, we calculate, we pay attention to two figures, likelihood and probability. So likelihood tends to be more qualitative, but I'm still going to need some kind of number anyway for me to do some risk measurement. But probability is a statistical figure. What is the probability of that threat occurring, right? The chance of that threat occurring. So I can use it because if you see in the next chart, we'll talk about quantitative and qualitative analysis, right? Or risk assessment. So qualitative, we look at quantitative, sorry, we look at an objective value. I need a number, usually a monetary figure. Qualitative, I use languages like likelihood, like based on my expert judgment, right? And I assign a priority to the risk assessment. So this is a table for quantitative. How do we calculate a quantitative risk assessment? Okay, so I'm going to need to know the value of my asset. I'm going to do my exposure factor. When I have my exposure factor, then I can calculate my single loss expectancy, which is usually the exposure factor multiplied by the asset value, right? So that would be the cost of a single loss happening. But then I need to figure out what is the annual rate of occurrence. In some of the certification exam, you need to calculate. They might give you some figures and you need to make that mathematical calculation. But it's good to know the formula. Then the annualized loss expectancy, ALE, will be the cost per year that you expect from that threat, which will be the single loss expectancy multiplied by the ARO, right? You can also do some internet research about calculation. There are some websites that give you figures and give you some exam questions or some practice questions to calculate the chances of that happening. But feel free to send me more questions, right? So now look at this qualitative risk assessment on the screen in here. So I'm going to talk about the probability of the threat and then the impact of the threat. If you see on here in this table, you might say the threat can cause almost no damage, is very low. And then look on the top. Something that is likely fairly common but not extreme frequent threat. You can assign that level. So based on the level that you assign, you can decide to have a strategy to treat that risk, right? So risk reporting obviously is part of the risk assessment. If you assess the risk and you don't report it, it's like meaningless, right? So there's no point in analyzing the cybersecurity risk unless it gives you some kind of actionable information, right? So you can give to the stakeholders to decide what to do. So of course you have the internal one, and this is really part of your due diligence. Remember last chapter 1, we talked about due care and due diligence, right? This is part of the process, right? So you hear the word risk appetite. Basically, it's like food. What's your appetite for food, right? What's your appetite for risk? So organizations that are trying to expand, they call them expansionary organizations, are risk hungry, right? Whereas conservative organizations are risk averse, meaning they don't really want to take much risk. Of course, you have neutral organizations that's in between. But no matter what you do, you need to decide what is the strategy for you as it relates to this risk. What am I going to do about the risks that I've identified, or about done the assessment, right? So these are 5 approaches to risk treatment or risk management. So you have Risk avoidance, you don't engage in the activity. Risk transference, which is either buy insurance or outsource it. Risk mitigation means I'm going to have some kind of controls or countermeasures to try and fix the risk, reduce the risk. And the risk deterrence, which is what I need to do to discourage the attack. Of course, risk acceptance, I accept the risk. If you decide to accept the risk, you need to document it very well, because that could become a legal liability issue. But sometimes organizations, when they figure out the cost of controlling the risk, if it's more than the risk itself, as in the quantitative risk, they might choose to accept the risk. Example would be, if I've calculated, risk, remember, say I've calculated the likelihood multiplied by the impact, right? I got a numeric figure, say it's $10,000 for the risk. It's going to cost me $20,000 to control the risk. You might say, hey, it's worth it. I'm just going to accept the risk. Let me not spend the money, right? So you now have when you're doing the calculation, there are also things you need to figure out. What's the risk on a return on my investment, right? So this is a major point now that companies are purchasing cybersecurity insurance, right? What's the return on my investment for putting that cybersecurity control in there, buying, having a firewall appliance, instead of having a unified device, buying separate devices. But when you need to do that, you need to make sure you understand what's called TCO, the total cost of ownership, right? It's also very important even in thinking about cloud, moving to the cloud. What is the cost of me buying all these computers as opposed to the cost of using a cloud service provider? So total cost of ownership is a doctrine that you should know. It means not just buying the equipment, also maintenance of the equipment, insurance on the equipment. These are all part of it, right? So whatever you need to do, you need to choose a strategy, right? You can do it by the risk type. Just telling you here, you must obviously respect the IP of the organization. You need to figure out long-term or short-term strategy in terms of your risk approach, right? Some risk mitigation techniques will view like technical controls, as in using technology to fix it. Of course, policies and procedures, monitoring, and then auditing and remediation. So there's two doctrines, which is exceptions and exemption, right? So if you have an exception, basically it's just an unauthorized issue that hasn't been acted upon. An exemption would be non-compliance issues documented and you've accepted it through some kind of formal process, right? Involving like the person that owns the asset, management, and all that. Just notice. You might rarely see this on the exam, but it's just for definition purposes. All right, so any kind of security assessment is whether you do it based on the threats, the risk of vulnerability, you must treat it as sensitive information and distribute it on a need-to-know basis, because somebody else finds out, then that means they can figure out your weakness, right? Or how they can attack you, right? So this discussion point would be, if you're sitting down in an organization, you need to talk about how to begin a risk assessment and how to manage your risk, right? How do you start it and how do you decide as an organization to manage the risk? All right, so the risk is not just internal, it could be based on the supply chain. So if you heard about this like SolarWinds attack, these are all attacks on supply chain. We discussed it briefly in the other chapter, but if you receive a hardware or software from the vendors, just know that it could be compromised. It might have a malware inside. That's why you need to just make sure, right? And of course, data that you share with third parties might be intercepted in transit or while in their hands. So you need to be careful to know what to do as it relates to the supply chain, right? Or involving third parties, right? So for supply chain, you need to make sure identify who are your critical vendors. You need to know the security of each of the vendors. I think it was Target had an attack that came through, I think, a subcontractor or a third party that they were doing business with, right? How do you mitigate the risk based on the assessment result for that third party? Review the changes to the supply chain and know whatever you need to do for them, right? Because the people that you do business with might not necessarily have the same security in place as you do. So you have your vendors, suppliers, outsourced service providers, and you have this managed service provider. Managed service provider basically are like the outsourced guy. So you see here, you see sometimes they mix the terminologies together, right? So, but supplier would be any individual who sells business-to-business products. It could be like, say, Office Depot. If you're in the Middle East, could be Carrefour or any kind of, right? A vendor is the person who provides what's called off-the-shelf or custom-made tools, which would be like SolarWinds, makes their own tools for you to purchase. That would be a vendor. So the vendor is the person, the manufacturer, one for lack of a better term, right? All right. So in this situation, you need to make sure that let's talk about some of the agreements. When you're trying to assess your vendors, make sure you look at your business agreement. In your agreement, what are my rights to audit you? And maybe issue risk questionnaire so you can see what their risk posture is, how strong they are. Of course, auditing, maybe can I do pen testing? And of course, monitor your vendors, right? All right, so a lot of things has to do with did you select the vendor with enough information? So you need to select vendors based on their reputation, how well, of course, their solution fits your need, regulatory compliance, financial health, and obviously their commitment to support you and scalability if you need to expand in the future, right? These are considerations when you're trying to select a vendor. So these are the steps in risk management lifecycle. This question asks you to order them. This will be like an exam question. So you know that obviously number one is you have to obviously identify your risk, and then you must obviously control it. And after you've controlled your risk, you will now, sorry, first you have to identify your risk, and then you assess your risk. Then you now control it, and of course, continuous review and monitoring, right? This question says you're shopping for a new AC unit for your server. Which combination will minimize the time you will have to go without sufficient cooling? Choose the best response, right? So how you look at this is, if I have a mean time before failure, a high mean time, going to take a long time before it's going to fail, and a low mean time to repair. That's a good combination for me. That's why B is a good answer here, right? So your risk management program question here talks about choosing the best response in here, right? So now you have a email server, right? You think it's unsecure. You want to outsource the email to an external company that provides secure cloud-based email. So whenever you hear the word outsourcing or insurance, think transferring the risk, right? All right. So this one here. What type of risk assessment is most likely to follow a serious security incident? Choose the best response. So now the incident has occurred. So what do you need to do? Probably a best approach, ad hoc, right? Because you didn't say I'm going to do it one time, then it wasn't a recurring one, right? What best describe how risk tolerance differs from risk appetite? Choose the best response. So now when you see this question, you pause the video, then you answer and see if your answer is right, right? Risk tolerance more often describes defined risk threshold. All right, so module B, here, the whole idea is to describe security assessment and audits and apply them and then plan security tests. So normally when I'm thinking about how do I control, do quality control in my organization, or what are the procedures, maybe how do I do tests? How do I assess it? So to explain a little more, of course, evaluation, say, security auditing. Many times auditing could be done internally or externally, right? So I'm going to see how effective are my security controls. I need to check my logs. I need to see user permissions, financial records. So look at this chart. You would have seen this before if you saw anything with project management or some normal process. You have what's called the Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA. You know, you plan it, right? You perform a limited test. You verify that the plan worked. You apply the test fully, and then, of course, you design. You may go back and forth. But obviously, the plan always is the first thing that you do. So be aware of this cycle, right? All right, so cybersecurity threats, you need to be aware of it. We discussed it briefly. New threat sources and what are the attack techniques that the adversaries are coming up, right? New security tools, regulations. These are things you should, that's why most of us, I said in chapter 1, always get a lot of email daily because we want to see what is going on in industry, right? So what you need to do is do a vulnerability assessment, see how weak your organization is. Of course, to do an assessment, it's good to have a baseline, figure out what is the attack surface, control review, the procedures and the design that you want to come up with, right? Some of the vulnerability assessment procedures will involve choosing the nature of the test, use the chosen method, validate the result, remediate the result. Let me pause here for a minute here. All right, so let's see here. We've resumed, but let's continue our slide deck, making sure that we are on the same place. Let's stop the share for a minute. I want to check what we have done so far on the slide deck. Make sure that we're continuing our slide. So, but risk management is a very important concept in cybersecurity. That is why many organizations want to hire individuals that are certified, right? They have the appropriate certification that goes with the industry that they want to work in. All right, so you have vulnerability scan and you have pen testing. So let's compare. Vulnerability scan is a little more broader. It looks at your entire system, your network, right? You maybe might be looking for a specific list of known vulnerabilities. Whereas a pen test is a simulated attack. Simulated attack because it's basically designed to determine whether an adversary could compromise an asset in your organization, right? So know the distinction between vulnerability scan and a pen test. So a recon or reconnaissance is a very good tool to spy on your opponent, but you can also use it to harden your organization to see what you have available out there, especially with open source. So here it's I have a video on here showing the lab about gathering site information. If you use a tool called WAP Analyzer or Hack Search, it's an app you can attach to like Firefox, enables you to see what is happening, right? So this again are assessment questions about audit. You choose this one here is audit is the answer to this one. The next one in here about scanning, select all here. I want to look for open ports. I want to identify vulnerabilities and I want to passively test my security controls. So one tool you can use in here, I'm not covering here, is Nmap. It tells me open ports. You just scan an IP address. It tells you the open ports in that system. All right, this other question in here, the answer here, pause it and look for the answer. That is hyping. So hyping is an interesting tool. It's a packet crafting utility used to attackers and you as the good guy, pen tester, right? Hopefully a blue team guy or red team guy. Which of the following tools are used primarily to gather open source intelligence? So select all that apply. DNS enumerator is a good tool there, and the harvester is also a good tool. It's available on Kali Linux. You can it tells you like email addresses for people in an organization. For like the harvester, you will plug in. So using Google as a database, and you put a company, and it will tell you what Google has or what LinkedIn has on those people. It's a very good tool. This other question here, basically, I am trying to so which kind of review are hosting, gathering, and network scanning most useful for? This is to check your attack surface. All right, let's round up with module C. I'll turn on my video again here for module C. We want to look at performing vulnerability scans plan our pen testing and remediating discovered vulnerabilities. Because what's the purpose of finding vulnerabilities if I don't want to do anything about it, right? So here, the goals of vulnerability scanning is a long range, but it also depends on what your organization wants you to do. Everything might include finding missing security controls, open ports with Nmap, weak encryption, unpatched firmware and software. The list could be as long as you want it to be, but the idea is, why am I doing that scanning of my system, right? So it could be both intrusive or non-intrusive as it relates to my network system, right? It could be credential or non-credential, meaning I have to enter my username and password, right? That one has the different purposes. So there are different types of scanner. You have an infrastructure scanner. I'm looking for a host operating system, third-party application, and of course, the web application scanner is self-explanatory, maybe generic web servers or my applications, and then the cloud scanners for maybe my cloud service accounts or APIs. But there's something called SCAP. You should be aware of it, Security Control Automation Protocol. So they tend to use combination of all these initial CPEs, CVEs, but what you need to do here is when you scan a system, it is good to use a tool that has what's called SCAP feed. Okay, it has a database subscribing to what's called a SCAP field. So you can look for, because how are you going to know what maybe potential weakness unless you have it from a database? So one of the good database or the feed is the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, which is maintained by the US government, right? And also, it's not just to figure out vulnerability, but also maybe I need to make sure I'm having some kind of compliance. So I will videotape, do a scan. I might submit the video or the report of the scan to the US government to see that I'm in compliance with all EU government to show that I'm in compliance, right? But just know that it could be for my system, but also it could be because the government requires me to submit it. So I might do a little documentation of what I did, right? So pen testing, again, you say how far you take a pen test depends on your security needs and the resources you want to put towards it, right? How much money you want to do, right? So the best pen test requires significant resource and expertise. You don't want a neophyte to come and pen test your organization, right? You want more experienced guys. I'm not giving a plug, but you want to hire me and my team to pen test your organization, right? But the whole idea is the pen test is designed to verify that a particular threat exists, not just does this attack exist at all, but can this attack damage my system, right? So just the one thing that pen tests don't do is comprehensively scan for vulnerabilities like a vulnerability scan, because you only know the status of vulnerability that you've tested, right? So this is a similar step. You plan it, you discover, you do the attack, you try to maybe iteration, and then of course, finally you're going to report. You're going to give you a report. So many pen testing tools or software might help you with this reporting. You can send a report to the client saying this is what we did, and this is what we find, right? These are newer terminologies to go with the older ones about difference between black box testing, white box testing. Black box just means I don't know about the environment. White box, I have a lot of information about the environment. And then the gray box testing is partially known environment. It fits in between the two, right? So these are some team members involved in pen testing. Red team, they are the ones attacking. Blue team are the ones that are defending. White teams are like the referees. And then purple team are basically teams that have red and blue team capability. You know, when you mix red and blue, I think the color comes out to be purple. That must be how the name comes up, right? And then, of course, white team issuing the flag, right? For you. All right. These are some tools you can use for attacking. I love Netcat and NCAT. Password cracking tools from John the Ripper to Kill Enable. There are many other tools, right? Some of them are available on Kali Linux or standalone. I love Kali Linux, and of course, Parrot is there for you too. So we want to plan your test. Why am I doing the test? What's the overall reason? How much time and resources? What should be included in it? How are the teams expected to communicate during the testing process? So you need to cover all of this, right? But when you're doing the recon, which is basically spying or whatever, you can do it passively or actively engaging the system, and of course, vulnerability analysis, right? When I'm doing my pen testing, if I'm trying to pen test the network, I might want to do what's called privilege escalation, which means I want to go from maybe a regular user to an admin. I want to have more control, right? Besides just lateral movement between user A and user B. I mean, especially if they are on the same level, I want to get more credentials so I can do more damage, right? So it says pivot to view or access other network systems. It's a lateral movement to go through the network to get closer to your goal. So these are different techniques that I can use. I'm doing my pen testing, right? All right, so discussion to decide the difference between vulnerability scanning and pen testing, and why will I want to do each one, right? Vulnerability is more broader, pen testing, trying to attack your system. So this is a good result that you might see after a pen test result. Look at here. It says vulnerability. Somebody found an Apache web server, right? Also found weak encryption algorithm. So it now gives you a severity level. You see a severity level, right? And it talks about the host that was scanned, which is 192. But you know that if you know a little about networking, these are like private IP addresses internal. That means this guy was inside your network doing this scan, right? It doesn't give you a routable IP address. It gives you the location. You see port number 80, which is HTTP, right? And then 22, right? That's SSH, right? You don't need to know this unless you're going to do networking. I'm just telling you what those means, right? So it matches what the report says. So if the port number didn't match what that guy was saying on the left side, be like, this is a little unusual, right? That's the reason why you need to know port numbers. That's why I tend to recommend do your A plus, do your net plus, then do your security plus, so you can understand port numbers, right? So how do you confirm and validate your result, right? You need to obviously fix it, right? Credential scans can generate what I call false positives. But here, security scanning will reduce the rate of false negatives, but may lead to more false positives, which means you thought there was an error, there wasn't an error, right? So if you see a false positive, document it to disregard it in future scan. In other words, it wasn't a bad thing, you thought it was a bad thing. Maybe that's not as dangerous as if something was bad, you said it wasn't bad, right? That's what you need to be careful about. So you watch out for false negatives. You watch out for false positive too, but false negative would be something that you kind of want to make sure that you fix. So prioritizing your vulnerabilities, difficulty of remediation, the risk tolerance of the organization, these are things that you need to take into consideration, right? And what's your plan for remediation? If I find like that guy found an Apache software or an outdated software, I need to patch it, right? And make sure I have configuration management. If I cannot fix it, I'm using Windows 7, I need to include what's called compensatory controls. Or if it's a bad node or device, I need to consider isolating it and make sure I do end user awareness, education, and training. And then am I going to accept the risk? Just be careful. And then change my business requirement, right? So management exemptions and exceptions, these are very tricky. You need to get written approval to make sure that these are official. Explore compensatory controls if it's due to the difficulty of the remediation, right? But the other way, you need to make sure you document your exceptions and your exemptions. If you did some kind of remediation to fix the problem, you need to run the scan again to make sure that it did what it's supposed to do, right? You basically want to verify that you really fixed that vulnerability, right? So it's no longer there, right? So this could verifying that change has been applied by configuration audits or attempting to exploit the vulnerability. It's a good prayer, right? And of course, you now continue to monitor your system. Generating your vulnerability report, just like a pen testing report. Since reports intended for non-technical managers, and executives, avoid jargons. Don't say, oh, I looked at port number 22 SSH. I saw private IP addresses. No, just tell them in layman's language, right? Of course, if it's for technical personnel, you need to include more in-depth description and analysis. I need to tell them why we should have a DMZ there, why we should have maybe a particular firewall, not just having a unified thread devices and stuff, right? Of course, just understand that your report should go with the audience. So footprint a website is a good exercise that you could do. Find tools out there to help you do that, right? This is a good example, a question. Full knowledge, that's a trick in that question. Not trick, but that's the buzzword. Full knowledge means white box, right? Don't confuse the hat with the box. The hat is the type of attackers that we covered chapter 1, right? The box is knowledge of the item, right? Conducting security assessment, you need to first, if you want to establish persistence, right? So you can basically come back later on, right? The main problem is that you got it through a session hijacking attack that both took lock and precise timing and might be cut off at any time. So because you have limited time, what should be your next step? I got in there almost like it's a lock. I need to make sure I can stay so I can come back later on, right? So that would be why establishing persistence is important. This next one in here, credential scan. So which of the following tests will be least intrusive while achieving your goal? So it says your supervisor wants to find missing or misconfigured security controls on a production network. It has numerous critical services that are sensitive to excessive or non-standard traffic. This is why you want to use credentials scanning here. For SCAP, the best response on this answer, look at the last slide, is the XCCDF. Conducting security assessment, right? So here, I want to, this question B and C, let me tell you this because I analyze this question and some people might tell you the answer to this will be B. So if I was writing this, I would not have this. The answer here says C, but consider it could also be B. So in an exam situation, you choose the best of those two. So again, summary, we know we covered a lot. I tried to keep it as short, but I couldn't. I tried the best. You should identify your assets and threats and how to calculate it and manage the risk, and how to categorize your common quality control procedures using cybersecurity, and plan vulnerability assessment, including your vulnerability scan and your pen testing. So this is the other video I was telling you about that I created about a year ago. It's a shorter video. Why this one is a little more in-depth is that video is 9 minutes. I think now this one is almost getting on 4 minutes. So please feel free to send me questions. And the next step, I'll try and do the next chapter as soon as possible. For the students in my university course, please, this should be chapter 2 for you. Send me questions. I will try and create a video for chapter 3. For those who are sitting for the Security Plus exam, which is this SY0-701, this is also part of the learning objectives. Right? So thank you for listening, and I wish you good luck in your exam, but don't forget to subscribe so you can get the upcoming videos. And of course, like the video. Thank you.